Northern Montana, January 1978. The kind of cold that doesn't arrive, it claims territory. Wind pours down from Canada and finds every nail hole, every warped seam, every mistake a man ever made with a hammer. Most nights out here are dark enough to swallow a barn whole, except for one place. A steady amber glow behind weathered boards on the Hartley place, night after night, as if someone had lit a small sun and refused to let it die. Folks assumed Caleb Hartley was up late fixing a tractor or checking a heifer, but the light didn't move. It held. And when the temperature sank below zero and kept falling, the glow stayed stubborn, like it had no business surviving. They didn't know there was a second home inside that barn. A curved shell of steel, small, tight, and bright, built like a tunnel in the center of emptiness. By the time the worst blizzard in decades rolled in, the same men who smirked at what he'd done would drive through drifts just to see one number on a thermometer, the reading that turned jokes into silence. They called it hiding. A man in his 40s living inside a tin caterpillar like a hermit who'd lost his nerve. At the diner in Cutbank, someone said he'd gone soft. At the grain elevator, someone else said, "Real winter builds real men." The jokes weren't loud out here. Ridicule is usually delivered with a grin and a shake of the head, but they carried. What they couldn't see through the barn planks was the shape, a half-cylinder of corrugated steel, about 12 feet wide and 18 long, sitting on a simple timber base, not attached to the barn, not leaning on it, just nested inside with open space on every side, like a moat of cold air. Caleb had set it 40 feet from the nearest exterior wall, centered under old beams hand-hewn in the 1920s. And he'd moved in like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Cot lamp shelves, a small barrel stove. No speeches, no explaining, just the quiet conviction of a man who's tired of waking up to frost on the inside of his own window. Caleb hadn't always been the odd one. 4 years earlier, he'd built a respectable log cabin east of the barn-tight corners, decent, chinking a fieldstone chimney that drew clean when the wind allowed it. He'd done it with the hands of an ex-Navy Seabee, the kind of practical builder who'd learned overseas that comfort is a supply line, not a personality trait. But Montana doesn't reward respectable. It tests it. That cabin sat on a slight rise, taking northwest wind like a ship takes waves, relentless lateral punishing. By the third winter, he was feeding it like a hungry animal, 10, 11, sometimes 12 cords of pine and spruce, and still waking at dawn with his breath fogging the room. His woodpile lived under tarps that snapped loose every storm. Each log he hauled inside carried moisture with it, hissing, smoking, stealing heat, just to boil itself dry. Propane was worse. Prices jumped, deliveries got delayed, and in '78, the roads turned into a gamble. Burning inefficiently wasn't just expensive. It was a way to get behind on chores, behind on sleep, and eventually behind on survival. So Caleb did the one thing nobody expects a tough man to do. He built smaller. He'd been turning solutions over in his head bank, the foundation. With earth, build a tight entry vestibule, add layers to the walls when he saw the arches. Military surplus, the kind that once made quick shelters for field hospitals and equipment sheds. A neighbor 2 valleys over was tearing down an old Quonset structure and wanted it gone before the next snow load finished the job. The steel ribs were light enough to move with 2 men and stubborn enough to last 50 winters if you kept them dry. Caleb looked at them and didn't see a shed. He saw a shape that wastes less heat, an arch that doesn't have corners for cold to squat in, a shell that can be sealed, a volume you can actually afford to warm. He paid in cash and barter some bills, a case of beer and a promise to help pull a truck out of a ditch come spring. By dusk, the arches were stacked in his barn like a rib cage, waiting for breath. That night, with wind rattling the barn siding, Caleb laid out timbers on the dirt floor and measured twice by lantern light. Not because he was inspired, because he was cornered by weather and math. The barn itself was big, roughly 40 by 60 built, when men still trusted their shoulders more than machines. It leaked light through 100 cracks, and when the wind hit it broadside, the whole building groaned like a ship at anchor. But the frame was sound. The bones held. Caleb cleared the center bay and tamped the ground flat. He laid a simple floor system sawdust packed deep, 8 inches, maybe more, then planks over top. Not elegant, but sawdust traps air, and trapped air is honest insulation. Then he bolted steel to steel, arch to arch, until the little tunnel stood on its own 7 feet, at the crown just enough to stand without wasting headspace. He cut a tight door into one end and set a small barrel stove, inside nothing ornate, just a vertical drum with a 6-inch pipe running up, then out through the barn roof with a double-walled collar where heat could turn dangerous. A kerosene lamp hung from the ridgeline. Shelves hugged the ribs. A cot waited like a promise. When he stepped inside and pulled the door shut, the world got quieter. The wind still screamed, but it screamed outside the idea. If you asked Caleb what he'd built, he wouldn't have said thermal envelope or convection barrier. He'd have said he was done freezing. But the physics were there, whether anyone named them or not. First, stop moving air from stripping heat off your skin and your walls. Wind is a thief that never tires. The barn took the wind's fists. Inside the barn, the air was still cold, yes, but calm. Second, create a dead air buffer. The space between barn and steel shell wasn't wasted. It was a moat of quiet air that slowed heat loss the way a double-pane window does. Third, reduce heated volume. His old cabin was roughly 1,500 cubic feet. The steel tunnel was closer to 300. Warming a smaller pocket of air is not weakness, it's arithmetic. Fourth, keep fuel dry. Wet wood doesn't burn, it steams. A man can spend half his heat boiling water out of logs and wonder why he's still cold. Caleb stacked his firewood along the inner barn walls, where snow couldn't touch it, where air could move around it, where it would season fast. The setup didn't look brave, but it looked like something that might still be standing when the weather tried its best to erase you. The ridicule arrived like clockwork. Charlie Rourke Carpenter, proud of his straight lines and lasting roofs, came by in late November. He stood in the barn doorway, arms folded, staring at the steel tunnel as if it offended him personally. "That's not a home," he said. "That's a grain bin someone forgot to bury." Caleb didn't argue. Argument burns energy, and winter collects payment for wasted energy. He just nodded and kept fitting stovepipe and checking clearances. Others added their own warnings. Condensation will drip on you. Steel will sweat. You'll freeze anyway. You'll cook yourself if the stove runs hot. You'll go crazy in there. A rancher named Wade Dietrich laughed loud enough for the hayloft to hear. You turning into a mole. Hartley. Even Caleb's sister, calling from Billings, said people were talking like he'd fallen on hard times, like the barn glow meant desperation. Caleb told her the truth. He was sleeping, 8 hours at a stretch, waking without pain in his joints, keeping up with chores without the fog of exhaustion. Loneliness might be real, he admitted to himself, but loneliness doesn't freeze your lungs. The cold does. By early January, the air had a sharper edge, the kind of clear metallic cold that makes sound carry too far and makes your nostrils stick together when you inhale. Caleb kept his head down, checked his stovepipe twice a day, and wrote small notes in a pocket notebook. Times Wood added how the draft behaved, how the lamp flame leaned. Then the warnings came, not gossip official. A low-pressure system dropping out of Alberta, heavy with moisture, slow and mean. The kind that gathers strength over open land and arrives like a verdict. On January 7th, the sky dimmed to a dull pewter. By the 9th, the temperature had fallen past 18 below and kept sinking. The wind found new notes in the barn siding, higher, angrier. Snow didn't drift politely, it moved sideways, packing into corners, sealing doors, burying fence lines like a hand wiping a slate clean. Out on the prairie, men scrambled to move livestock into shelter. In town, people taped windows, layered blankets, prayed the power would hold. Caleb watched it all from the threshold of his barn and felt something colder than the weather, the knowledge that soon pride and theory would be useless. Soon there would be only results. The storm didn't last a night. It lasted like a siege, 6 days of wind, snow, and pressure that made buildings creak as if they were thinking about surrender. Drifts climbed to the eaves. Roads vanished. Power lines snapped under ice. The county became an island of white with no easy way out. His nearest neighbor, Ellis Larson, lived a mile and a half south in a newer wood frame house. Ellis had a propane furnace and a wood stove just in case. On day 2, the propane ran out. The refill truck hadn't made it in December, and now no truck would make it at all. Ellis turned to wood full-time, only to find his pile buried and wet. He dug out armloads that steamed in his living room, smoked up the chimney, and gave up heat just to dry themselves. It took newspapers, kindling, and 20 minutes of cursing to get a single log to flame. Inside Ellis's house, the thermometer hovered in the low 40s, then slid into the mid-30s at night. He moved mattresses near the stove. He wore his coat to bed. He woke coughing, then waking again because the sound of wind can be a kind of torment. 6 miles west, a family lost a chimney cap to ice. Smoke filled their rooms and forced them into their truck, idling through precious fuel. Winter doesn't care what you intended, it cares what you prepared. On January 12th, the official reading in town dropped to roughly 45 below. Wind chill sank near 70 below, cold enough to thicken diesel to turn breath into needles to make metal painful on contact. Outside became a place you visited only for necessities. Inside the barn, Caleb's world was quieter. The barn itself was bitter cold, but the wind had been killed. No gusts stripping heat off surfaces. No invisible hands prying at seams. Inside the steel tunnel, the barrel stove ticked and settled. Caleb fed it 1 split of dry pine every couple of hours. Not big rounds, small clean pieces that caught quickly and burned with bright certainty. He banked coals with ash before sleeping and woke to warmth that still clung to the air like a held breath. He wasn't living in luxury. He was living in control. He kept a thermometer hung from a rib at shoulder height and another tucked outside the barn under an overhang where snow couldn't bury it. He wrote the numbers down because memory lies when you're tired and cold. At midnight on the 12th, he stared at the inside thermometer and felt the strangest emotion, embarrassment almost. Not at what he'd built, at how simple it was. 56 degrees inside, while the world outside tried to kill everything with lungs. When the storm finally loosened its grip on January 15th, it didn't get kinder. The sky cleared to a hard, crystalline blue, the kind that makes the cold feel sharper, as if sunlight is only there to show you what you've lost. Snow lay sculpted into 10-foot walls against buildings. Vehicles were reduced to humps. Roads would be impassable for another week. Ellis Larson was the first to reach Caleb's place, arriving on a snowmobile in late afternoon with his face raw from wind. He expected to find Caleb holed up in the old log cabin, rationing the last of his wood, maybe half frozen and too proud to admit it. Instead, he found Caleb outside the barn, splitting kindling in his shirt sleeves, steam rising from his back. Ellis killed the engine and just stared. "You..." "All right," he managed, like he didn't trust his own eyes. Caleb nodded. "Come in." Inside the barn, the temperature was still brutal, but there was no wind, no roar, no hammering pressure. The stillness itself felt like relief. In the center bay sat the steel tunnel, faintly reflective in the slanting light. Caleb opened the door. Warm air rolled out in a wave so physical, Ellis took a step back. It wasn't comfort as a concept. It was comfort as evidence. Ellis stepped inside and blinked as if he'd walked into another season. The air smelled like dry pine and hot metal, not smoke-choked, not damp. A thermometer hung from a rib read 67 degrees. Ellis laughed once sharp and disbelieving. That can't be right. Caleb didn't answer with pride. He answered with paper. He reached for a small notebook on a plank table and slid it over like a receipt. Every 4 hours, date time, exterior temperature, interior temperature, and the weight of wood added. On the worst night, when outside sank near 45 below, Caleb's interior had dipped to the mid-50s at its lowest, then climbed back into the low 60s with a few careful feeds of the stove. Ellis flipped pages slower and slower. He'd burned close to 1,000 pounds of wood across the 6 days, more if he counted broken furniture and emergency scraps. Caleb's summary page showed roughly 120 pounds total, about 20 pounds a day. Ellis looked up and you could see something shifting behind his eyes. Anger at his own house, embarrassment at his own assumptions, relief that at least one man in the valley had slept. How, Ellis asked. Not accusing, not mocking, just hungry for the mechanism. Caleb tapped the steel wall. It's not magic, it's leakage. I stopped the leaks. Caleb walked him through it the way a mechanic explains an engine plane, step by step, no poetry. Drafts are theft. In a log cabin, every seam is a negotiation with wind. Even small gaps become highways for cold air to pour in low and push warm air out high. Caleb's steel shell, bolted tight, offered fewer negotiations. The door sealed. The stovepipe fit snug. No ankle-level knife of cold. No ceiling-level escape of heat. Then the barn, it took the wind's violence. Convection is what turns cold into cruelty. The moving air that strips warmth faster than your stove can replace it. Inside the barn, the air sat still. 10 degrees warmer than outside, sometimes 15, not because it was heated, but because motion was gone. Still air is a slower enemy. The big buffer, the air gap between barn walls and steel shell, worked like a second skin. Heat had farther to travel through calmer air before it could be lost to the outside. And finally, volume. I'm not trying to heat a whole cabin, Caleb said. I'm trying to heat the space a man actually lives in. He pointed to the wood stacked along the barn's interior walls, protected from snow, ventilated, drying faster than anything under a tarp. Green wood is water with bark, he said. You spend your heat boiling it. Ellis nodded like a student who'd finally been shown the missing page. Word moved the way it always moves in winter country, not through advertisements, but through necessity. A cousin tells a cousin. A man who nearly froze speaks softer and listens harder. Within a week, a few neighbors showed up under the pretense of checking on Caleb, then lingered too long near the steel door, hungry for warmth and answers. Charlie Rourke came too late January, when pride had been worn down by 6 days of wind. He didn't say hello at first. He walked around the shell, tapped the ribs with his knuckles, stared at the stove pipe collar where it passed through the barn roof. He inspected clearances like he wanted to find a flaw he could name. Finally, he looked at the thermometer, then at the notebook. His jaw tightened. You got lucky, he muttered. Caleb shrugged. Maybe, but luck doesn't write the same number every 4 hours. Charlie almost smiled, and that was the closest thing to an apology you get from a man whose reputation is built on being right. More visitors came, ranch hands, older couples, a mother with a wheezing child, bundled in blankets, eyes tired from sleepless nights. Human stakes have a way of turning mockery into questions. Nobody asked Caleb to be brave anymore. They asked him to be precise. Caleb was careful what he let people copy. He told them the part that mattered most wasn't the steel, it was the principles. First principle, stop wind from touching your real living space. A big outer shell barn shed Even a tarp wall done right can be the first line of defense. Second, build an inner core that is as tight as you can make it. Not airtight in a dangerous way, still vent properly, but draft resistant. Seals overlaps closures that don't flutter when the wind rises. Third, keep the chimney safe. A stove that vents poorly kills quietly. Caleb showed them double wall sections near penetration's proper clearances from combustibles and how he checked creosote with a flashlight because a chimney fire in a blizzard is a sentence. Fourth, make fuel a priority. Dry wood is not a luxury. Its efficiency you can measure. He pointed out how his wood stacks were off the ground, spaced for airflow, protected from snow. Fifth, accept smaller as a strategy. A man doesn't win by heating empty air, he said. He wins by heating what matters. The hardest part wasn't construction, it was dignity. Some men couldn't bear the idea that comfort might be smarter than suffering. Caleb didn't preach. He just let the numbers do the talking. By March, the first adaptation appeared 15 miles south. Hank Sabota didn't have surplus arches, but he had leftover steel roofing panels and an unused dairy barn. His family had spent the January storm sleeping in coats, burning twice what they could afford, and listening to their youngest cough through the nights. Hank framed a small core room inside the barn, 12 by 10, sheathed it in roofing panels, and packed straw bales around the outside as a crude buffer. He vented a small stove through the barn roof with more courage than elegance, then moved his family into the core during the tail end of winter. It wasn't as efficient as Caleb's setup. The seals weren't perfect. The straw settled. But Hank's wife later told people the same thing with a quiet seriousness. We slept. Soon there were more versions. One man insulated a corner of his pole barn and lived in it like a ship's cabin. Another cut a door into an old grain bin and added a proper chimney collar. A third built a framed warm room inside a machine shed, lining the interior with sheet metal and adding a tight entry to reduce heat loss. None looked identical. All carried the same DNA, outer windbreak, inner core dead air buffer, dry fuel smaller volume. Winter doesn't grade style, it grades outcomes. That spring, the county extension agent drove out Robert Kilmer, the kind of man who'd spent his life translating hard lessons into bulletins nobody reads until they're desperate. He arrived with a notebook and a camera boots crunching on old snow. He didn't laugh. He didn't praise. He measured. He asked for Caleb's logs, checked the placement of the outdoor thermometer, and compared notes with Ellis Larson's records from the same week. Robert even brought a second thermometer calibrated, hung it beside Caleb's for an hour, and watched the readings settle together. Then he photographed the layout, the barn dimensions, the clearance around the inner shell, the stove pipe path, the wood storage along the barn wall. He drew simple diagrams and wrote down principles in plain language. Not innovative, not revolutionary, just efficient cold weather sheltering using nested windbreak structures. That fall, a bulletin circulated through Montana and into the Dakotas. Some folks dismissed it as odd frontier folklore, but the ones who'd nearly frozen, those who'd watched propane run out and wet wood fail, folded it carefully and filed it where they could find it in a hurry. Caleb never asked to be a lesson. He just built a way to get through a winter that didn't care about his reputation, and the land quietly rewarded him with sleep. By the third winter, Caleb refined without changing the soul of it. He cut a small south-facing window in the end wall, not for heat, just for daylight, because darkness can wear down a person as surely as cold. He built a short vestibule entry so opening the door didn't spill warmth like water. He added a drying rack above the stove for gloves and socks because damp fabric steals morale. He could predict his wood use with unsettling accuracy, not because he was obsessed, because control is comforting when the world outside is chaos. A few pounds here and there depending on wind and outside temperature, but close enough that he could plan. People stopped calling it strange. It became simply Caleb's place. The jokes faded into the background hum of community memory like old storms and old grudges. Charlie Rourke even started mentioning nested shelters to customers when someone complained about heating bills, though he never admitted where he got the idea. And Ellis Larson, still a proud man, rebuilt his wood storage undercover, raised it off the ground, improved his seals, and made a small warm room in his house for the coldest nights. He didn't live in a steel tunnel, but he did stop pretending suffering was the only proof of strength. Out here, winter is the judge, and the verdict is always practical. If there was a single detail that sealed the story into local legend, it wasn't the steel or the barn. It was the notebook. The plain, unromantic pages filled with times and temperatures, proof that didn't care who liked you. On the night outside, dropped near 45 below Caleb's inner space, stayed above the mid-50s. On calmer days, it rode in the low 60s. He did not burn through stacks of fuel. He did not wake every 2 hours to feed a dying fire. He did not sit in a room full of smoke trying to pretend it was warmth. And that difference mattered to more than comfort. It meant he could work the next day without shaking hands. It meant he could check stock without stumbling from exhaustion. It meant he could keep his head clear when the weather turned the world into a white wall. When people finally admitted it out loud, it came as a quiet confession. I thought he was ashamed. Turns out I was. Near the end of winter, Caleb went into town, sat at the diner, and heard someone telling the story at the next table. The teller exaggerated. Of course, stories always swell. But the core stayed intact. A man got laughed at. Then the blizzard arrived, and numbers did what arguments never can. Before spring, Caleb wrote one more line in his notebook. Not a temperature, just a reminder. Efficiency isn't surrender. It's respect for the math. If you're still here, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. And I want to know the coldest winter you've ever had, to endure the kind that made you rethink what you thought you knew about shelter. Because the frontier lesson isn't that steel is magical or that barns are warm. The lesson is simpler. When conditions get brutal, pride becomes expensive. Wind-stripping drafts, wet fuel, oversized space, those are costs winter will collect whether you notice them or not. Caleb Hartley didn't outmuscle the storm. He outplanned it. He reduced the space he needed to heat, killed the wind before it could touch his shelter, trapped still air as a buffer, and fed his stove dry wood that actually gave back what it promised. And when the blizzard tried to turn the county into a frozen graveyard of broken assumptions, his little inner room held steady, quietly, undeniably. Out here, frontier life never rewarded habit just because it was familiar. It rewarded what worked. Educational note: this is a historically inspired reconstruction for storytelling and education. Names, characters, and specific details are fictionalized, while the physics and practical principles are real and widely established. Any modern application must follow current building codes, fire safety standards, and local laws. This is not professional engineering, technical, or legal advice.